Hello, I'm Lucas Kanga, and the topic we're going to discuss today is personality and mental models. A term so well known, yet so interesting, needs to be defined. And we're going to do that by saying that personality is the sum of the dynamic characteristics that allow me to be who I am, and to relate to my environment. If we look at this definition, we'll realize that one of the most important characteristics of personality is flexibility. Is that a binay? As we've already defined, to have two characteristics that aren't opposites but can be used flexibly whenever I need them. What for? To relate to my environment and to be who I am. That's why, for example, we could use extroversion or introversion, saying I am extroverted or introverted when I need to be. Obviously, I have a mental model that relates to my natural characteristics from birth, but also to my environment or situation. I can quite easily develop the paradoxical characteristic. Clearly, I will be able to be both extroverted and introverted, but if I use the one that isn't natural to me, I'll do it with more effort. Remember when we discussed Hebb's law, and that when the pathways were more reinforced, it was easier to access them, much more economical, much more efficient. That's why personality allows us to relate to our environment, to change the way we do things, but sometimes at cost. Let's talk about some of the characteristics of personality. And for that, I'm going to use a model that's quite widespread around the world. It's called the Myers-Briggs, or MBTI. What is the MBTI? Over the years, researchers have tried to classify the different mental models of humans and have looked for ways to divide the existing personalities. Remember, there are millions of connections grouped into certain boxes or models. And that's why Myers-Briggs, which is one of the most widely used worldwide, not just because it's easy to use, but also because of how it helps us understand things, divides personality styles into 16 types. But in order to divide it into 16 types, it needs what are called 4 dyads. In other words, 4 paradoxical relationships, which we're going to start describing now. The first one has to do with, where do I get my energy from? When a person gets their energy from the outside, we call them extroverted. When they get their energy from within, we call them introverted. That's what is commonly known. But if we delve a little into neuroscience, we'll talk about something called the ARAS, the Ascending Reticular Activating System, which is a group of neurons located in the center of the brain. In the much more reptilian part, which allows us to activate the cortex. The human cortex is the only part that doesn't activate itself and needs another element called ARAS. So people who activate their cortex a lot by themselves, we'll call them introverts. They don't need to connect with other people, or be in noisy places, or talk all the time, nor do they need to be constantly in places with lots of people. On the contrary, introverts try to avoid it because they have too much cortex activation. On the other hand, extroverts, since they have less cortex activation due to the ARAS, what they need to do is connect, seek out people, play music while studying, turn on the lights if you notice. Extroversion and introversion are related to a biological characteristic, which is the way the cortex is activated in humans. The second personality trait we're going to describe in the MBTI is, where do I get my information from? I can get information through my senses, or I can get it through intuition. What's the difference? When I get it automatically, that is, without taking into account readings or data or historical records, I do it intuitively, quickly, nimbly, and absolutely efficiently. There may be mistakes, but there can also be mistakes when doing things sequentially or using the senses. Why? Because obtaining information through the senses is always limited. We don't have unlimited resources. We always have information that the seller wants to give us, or that we find in a magazine, or that we find on a website. But if we think about it, the way decisions are made could be summed up as either I do it with my senses, I touch it, I look for it, I see it, or I go with my intuition. What specific number of decisions are made based on intuition? It's not known exactly, but most of life's complex decisions are made with intuition, much less with rational abilities or information at hand. Just imagine, if we didn't have this paradox, we wouldn't be able to intuit anything, and if we didn't have data, we wouldn't be able to make decisions. Now, imagine this at an organization a little. What would that be like? Let's move on to the third dimension, and we'll call it thought or emotion. And that's how decisions are made. Either we make them rationally, with the T. Later on, we'll see in the model that it's called the T for thinking, or the F for feeling. You'll see that many times we weigh up more what people are going to feel about a decision than the economic benefit of it. We often value more what people will feel about a decision than its economic return. But decisions also have to be made on a rational level, with economic gain or some other quantifiable value. Because that's the objective of many organizations. Some leaders make decisions based on emotion, and others on rationality. So we've already covered 3 of the elements, and now let's move on to the last one, which is, what kind of environment do I prefer? Generally, this method describes 2 types of environments. Myers-Briggs. In the MBTI, it describes either we make decisions in concrete, measurable, predictable environments, or in environments that are entirely perception-oriented or offer multiple options. We'll notice that people who have the letter P for perception are much more flexible and don't see things as having to be a certain way. There's a fairly common phrase among those who perceive with the letter J, known as judges, who are much more rule-bound, and they say, "This is how it is." The others, those with the other paradoxical relationship, the letter P, actually say, "It could be this way, but it could also be that way," and they see many more shades of grey. In fact, as an example, those with the letter J, or judges. So we've now looked at these 4 characteristics, and we're going to move on to discuss. What does a mental model mean? A mental model is about combining the J-curve law, as we mentioned before, where every time I reinforce a personality trait of mine, I move further away from the one I don't have. And that makes me a bit less flexible. So there are certain traits, and you'll see people within organizations who really have a particular way of doing things and find it very hard to adopt another. Or they're very rational and can't be emotional. Or they're very emotional and find it very hard to make a rational decision. Or, for example, if they have multiple options, they get lost. You'll notice there's less flexibility. That means the paradoxical relationship is a bit less developed. In other words, they have more of one side, of a personality style than the other. This also has to do with a human trait. One has what is called the self. This is me, and this is my way of being. What does it mean to take on a way of being? Out of all the possible traits, I took on this one. Myers-Briggs, MBTI, tried to describe all this complexity in just 16 types. But we also have other styles that could be described in other ways. It is known that there are 16,953 described personality types, and in reality, it would be very difficult to see this within an organization. To sum up what we've seen today, let's start by saying that personality is the sum of a lot of traits that are dynamic, and they're dynamic because I need flexibility. Precisely when flexibility is lost, we would say that we're not dealing with a normal personality. Rather, we're dealing with a disorder. Once we've understood this, it's important to grasp which mental model defines the way we normally behave. It's a model I have, one that I prefer. And let's take some concepts we've seen in previous classes, such as, for example, Hebb's law, which says that the more I reinforce a personality, the easier it becomes for me to develop and express it. That's why there's a paradoxical relationship between, for example, being introverted or extroverted. If I reinforce being extroverted and keep reinforcing it more and more, I'll find it increasingly difficult to access introversion. I'll gradually lose flexibility. This is also a human characteristic. Why is it called a mental model and also referred to as the human connectome? Because we move from the form of the connectome, which says that every time I connect more, I reinforce many more connections. In our course, we'll understand that human connectome, mental model, and personality are synonyms. We saw that to define a large part of personalities, we use models. And we use a model called MBTI, which has 4 paradoxical dyads to define 16 models. In class, we'll look at each of the models, but let's stick with these 4 concepts. First of all, where do I get my energy from? Do I get it from the outside? Am I extroverted? Or introverted, if I get it from within? If I'm making decisions, seeking information through my senses, I'll be more sensing or more sensory. But if I make decisions based on intuition, I'll be more intuitive. The third is, how do I make decisions? Do I make them in a rational way or in an emotional way? And finally, what environments do I prefer? Do I prefer much more rigid environments or much more flexible ones, or those with possibilities? This was the first approach to a personality model. We will look at another, but this is enough for us to move on to the next stage. Thank you very much for taking part in this module, and I'll see you in future sessions.